Data protection is very much in the public eye at the moment, with the exploits of Julian Assange and the PRISM scandal. And we have new legislation on the stocks. Our data protection expert, Kirsten Whitfield, examines some of the issues coming out of this legislation. Well, Kirsten, I hear we have a new data protection regulation, but I understand it may not happen at all. What's the latest on this?
There was some speculation that it might fizzle out, but recently, in fact 12th of March, the European Parliament voted in their own version of the regulation. There were 623 votes for, 10 against and 22 abstentions. So that gave a pretty clear message that, albeit the European Parliament, not necessarily European Council, are determined to bring the regulation through to reality.
So if the regulation is not agreed by the end of this year, what's your view on this?
Well, it's all changed at the end of the year, so we get fresh blood in, European Parliament and European Council changes. But because the European Parliament voted in their version, what will happen is they'll just pick up the version they voted in and run with it going forwards. The European Council, I think, won't want all of their good work to go to waste either, so I expect they'll probably do the same.
So when is the regulation likely to come into force?
The European Parliament and the European Council both left the 2-year lead-in period intact. So if you assumed it took them to the end of the year to agree it, and then 2 years for it to come into force, we're looking at the end of 2016. But I wouldn't rule out that they might shorten that lead-in period, so you could see early on in 2016 these regulations coming into force.
Do we know whether the new legislation will be a regulation or a directive?
Yeah, so the significance of it being a regulation, which is what Viviane Reding, the EU Justice Commissioner, wanted, is that it will have direct effect and will be implemented without being implemented into national legislation. So the reasoning behind that was that it would be a uniform application across Europe. Now, there's been some member states that have argued against that, including the UK. But I don't think that they're going to win through with those arguments. I think, especially with the strong vote from the European Parliament, the likelihood is that it's going to come through as a regulation rather than being a directive as we currently have.
Do you think the European Parliament's version of the new regulation makes things better for organisations? Or was the European Commission's drafting better?
Well, I think the European Parliament's draft does make things a little bit easier in some cases. Things like the right to erasure, portability of data, those things that were introduced by the European Commission remain the same. The European Parliament has added new provisions around pseudonyms, so that's quite helpful. What they've added is that if someone uses a pseudonym, so you can't tell who it is, they might be calling themselves Mickey Mouse, that you can still get consent even though you don't know actually who's behind the pseudonym. They've also said that you don't need to go to the nth degree to try and figure out who it is behind the pseudonym for you to comply with all of your other obligations under the new data protection laws. The other thing that I think people will welcome is that instead of what the European Commission had proposed on breach notifications, which is they had to be notified within 24 hours, the European Parliament had proposed that it should be without undue delay, which then brings it in line with notification of data subjects who might suffer some harm as a result of the breach.
Could you take us through some of the biggest changes caused by the European Parliament's version of the regulation?
I think probably top of the list is that they've changed the amount that you could be fined for breaches of the new data protection regulation. So whereas the European Commission had proposed €1 million or 2% of global annual turnover, the European Parliament obviously didn't feel that that was tough enough, and they've proposed €100 million or 5% of global annual turnover. The European Commission had proposed that entities that are not based within Europe could be caught by the regulation. What they'd said is that if you're providing goods or services into Europe, or you're targeting people with behavioural monitoring within Europe, then you can be caught by the regulation. And the European Parliament have toughened up on this as well. And what they've said is actually that should be extended to any sort of monitoring, not just behavioural monitoring. So any entity outside of Europe that's carrying out any sort of monitoring within Europe will be caught by this new regulation. The other thing that they've done is they've extended the regulation to a new class of entities, which they call producers, which in effect is IT providers. So any entity that's providing the IT systems and the software to process personal data. And what the European Parliament have said is that regardless of the fact that they're not actually processing the personal data themselves, they will be caught by the regulation in that they have to design systems that will enable their customers to comply with the data protection regulation. The European Parliament have also tightened up on data transfers outside of Europe. So the European Commission had said that there could be data transfers if you've got regulator approval. And the European Parliament, they've removed that. So they've said there won't be any regulator approvals. And if there is any existing regulator approvals, they will run out after 2 years from when the regulation comes into force. They've also added that if an entity based outside of Europe, so a government body or a court, asks for personal data to be transferred to them from Europe, that data cannot be transferred unless there's a treaty in place to transfer the data and you have regulator approval from within Europe to transfer that data.
I know that in the European Commission's version of the new regulation, stricter rules on profiling caused a fluttering in the dovecots. What does the European Parliament's version say about profiling?
Well, the European Parliament have largely left that intact. So the European Commission had toughened up on profiling activities. So it's going to be harder to do and in many cases probably need consent. So the European Parliament have left that intact. What they have done though is they've defined what they mean by profiling, but it's actually a very, very wide definition. It's any effectively automated monitoring of people and their behaviour.
So what does the new regulation say about privacy notices?
The European Commission's draft had proposed a whole load of additional stuff that everybody's going to have to add to their privacy notices. And unfortunately, the European Parliament have added to the list, so we are going to end up with privacy notices that look like War and Peace. But what the European Parliament have suggested is that to make privacy notices easier to navigate, organisations should do them on a layered basis, so it's quick and easy to navigate around to the bit that you want to look at if you're the data subject. What they've also suggested is that there should be a use of a system of icons, which are a uniform system, and everyone will then recognise if you use a particular icon what that means in terms of use of your personal data.
In the light of a new version of the regulation, what should General Counsel be doing now?
I think if I were in their shoes, what I would be doing now is gathering together my team, possibly finding your data protection officer if you don't already have one, and I would be putting in place a 2-year plan to get compliant. And the reason for the 2-year plan rather than a 3-year plan, so it could actually be 3 years until the regulation comes in, but I would take a pessimistic view that possibly the lead-in period could be shortened and that we may have a year until we know what the final form of the regulation looks like, and then possibly a year for the lead-in period until it comes into force. And during those 2 years, in the first year, I would be looking at carrying out an audit and plug in any compliance gaps that you might have currently, so making sure that people are fully trained up. Your policies, notices, consent forms are all compliant with the laws as they are currently. It's under our Data Protection Act 1998. And then in the second year, I would be doing a refresh of my audit, so looking at what new processing you might have started to do during that 1-year period. And then I would be getting all of my policies and procedures, training, consent forms, all up to speed so that they're compliant and ready to go when the new regulation comes into force.
Thank you, Kirsten. Really interesting.